We are recording. What are we talking about?
Cool. We are talking about cleaning up the way we support multiple environments in Dewdrop, and specifically using that to use Dewdrop in Zen Framework 1 projects. So being able to use it on our older stuff, TRC, Graph and Sons, TitleNet, all that stuff. So I'll start off just with kind of the use cases and the front-end aspects of this, what you actually see when you're using it. So Graph and Sons is an older Zen Framework project. It's one of our first Zen Framework projects, actually. A lot of the admin sections use SWAT components. In this case, I've got a lot of bootstrappy stuff in here, but this core area here is all SWAT. So this is a SWAT toolbar, SWAT table view, SWAT frame is wrapping that entire thing. And the code for writing these admin UIs is not the most flexible in the world, and it's very different than what we've been doing on our Dewdrop project. Some recent Graph and Sons requests are going to require me to do some fairly big admin things, and I didn't want to do it on this old code base, just because I get the benefit of it in our newer stuff instead of, improving things we're only using on legacy projects at this point. So I wrote this integration so that I can use the Dewdrop version of all this stuff inside the older admins. So if I go to shipping methods, which is a random one I picked to use Dewdrop, it has all the Dewdrop stuff in there now. So the improved search, the ability to sort and group fields, the ability to edit and sort and all of that stuff, just normal Dewdrop running inside the context of Zen Framework 1. So I can now use the exact same code in all of the projects to do these types of admin components. The way that this looks from a project level is there's just an admin controller that's built into Dewdrop at this point. It's Dewdrop ZF1 controller action admin. You extend that instead of extending Zen controller action, and then any actions that you do have in place, so let's say I had just a public function index action like you would on a Zen Framework project, those will still work just like they normally would. Anything you don't have in there will fall back to the stock pages just like they would on a CRUD component and other Dewdrop projects. So the index action in this case is kind of similar to an index.php in your component folder in another Dewdrop project. So that's the idea of what I was wanting to achieve. Beyond that, this also gets us access to things like the tooling that we have with Dewdrop, so DB deploy being the biggest example of that. So with this Graph and Sons project on Zen Framework 1, I can now do Dewdrop DB deploy and get all of my normal DB deploy stuff that I would have from a Dewdrop project. So I don't have to use Fing or anything gross like that to do my tooling on an application anymore. And then this is also demonstrating you can pass options to Dewdrop via the application.ini. So that's what you're seeing there, is there's some integration on that level to pull stuff from the Zen Framework configuration file and put it into Dewdrop's Pimple dependency injection container. So those are kind of the features that we're talking about. The thing I wanted to really cover today from a code review standpoint is how are we supporting that in Dewdrop itself? Like, what does it look like when we add an environment like this? To start with, I'm going to look at a couple things on master, because what we're covering today changes a lot of stuff at this level of Dewdrop. So when you bootstrap a Dewdrop application, you start off in this file where it's detecting how do I bootstrap this application depending on what type of thing I'm running. So in the case of WordPress, for example, there's a single bootstrap that just tells it, hey, look in WP config, get the database configuration, and so on. But then in a Silex application, you kind of need to say some of that stuff explicitly because there's no WP config or anything like that. Like, we have to define that ourselves. So in these older versions of this setup, there's a lot of stuff like this, where you're saying, okay, I need to set up a session resource in Pimple, and I'm going to set that up differently depending upon whether I'm in WordPress in this branch up here, or if I'm in Silex in this branch down here. So the obvious thing to do if you were going to add Zen Framework would be to do another else if and say, if somehow I detect I'm in Zen Framework, then add a different resource for the session there. So you would just get these branches throughout Dewdrop of all these if, else if, and all this stuff for each different environment you wanted to support. To avoid that messiness, I introduced this concept of an ENV interface, so an environment interface. If you implement these methods, you can support a new environment in Dewdrop. So in the case of Zen Framework 1, this is the actual environment. So to detect if we're using Zen Framework 1, we look and see if there's a front controller instance, or if Zen controller front's at least available as a class. To get the configuration data for Dewdrop, we look in the Zen configuration, and we grab that there, so we don't have to duplicate that information. To get the bootstrap, we're not going to look in a Dewdrop config because, again, we get a lot of that already from Zen, so we just use a hard-coded ZF1 bootstrap class. To get Zen Framework 1 working on the command line, we have to do a little bit of auto-loading magic because it was developed before the auto-loading standards were really fully formed in the PHP community. Similarly, there's some other stuff to get it up and running and so on. So all of the Zen Framework 1 specific stuff is in this env file. All of the WordPress specific stuff is in this env file, and same thing for Silex. So all of that is isolated, and you don't have all these branches throughout Dewdrop to figure out which one you're going to use. The reason I really wanted to point this out is twofold. One, this is a type of refactoring that I think is really helpful to keep in mind when you're doing object-oriented work. It's basically refactoring a conditional into polymorphism. So instead of saying, if this, else that, and all this stuff, you just say, give me the version for this particular object. So you, instead of having a big conditional, you replace that with implementers of an interface that you're able to just call to directly. Another good example of that from this work is the session class in Dewdrop. What this used to look like is in every single method, we would do this check. We would say, if our session container is WP session, do this. Otherwise, we assume it's Silex in this older version, do this. And obviously, I would have to add another branch to say, if it's in Framework 1, then do this. So you would have that in every single method here. So, you know, if else, and so on. So similarly to what I was just showing, there's now just a session access interface where you define how that works for each environment, and then the session class just says return this access has. So it's the access object itself that is determining what's going to happen rather than a conditional that's checked every time you call the method. So I wanted to point it out for that refactoring, conditional refactored into polymorphism, because I think that's an important concept for object-oriented stuff. But also, I wanted to bring this up because at this point, it is very easy to run Dewdrop in another environment. So if you wanted to try to do Dewdrop stuff inside of Laravel or inside of Drupal or something like that, I think it would actually be pretty easy at this point. So I just wanted to point that out in case someone had something in mind that they would like to use, or if they want to try to pull in some Laravel components or something like that, I can help kind of move that along a little bit using this env stuff to glue it together. So yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. I'm hoping that with the ZF1 stuff, we can kind of breathe a little bit of new life into some of our older projects. You know, I could definitely see at some point maybe trying to sell agents title on improving some of their admin stuff using this. So yeah, I wanted to make people aware of it from that aspect as well. But I think that's all I really had to cover. Any questions on any of that?
Not really a question from me, but this is really great stuff, Brad. Thanks for sharing it with us. I'm excited about this because I'll be able to reuse this rather immediately. TitleNet, our agent's title, to use the DB deploy stuff for our deployments. So that'll be a really nice thing to have. And like you said, we can support other types of environments than what we have here. I guess I do have a question. Do you think these changes will warrant a 2.0 of Dewdrop, or are they relatively backward compatible?
Yeah, they should be completely backward compatible. The existing test cases pass on all three environments, and I've added test cases for a lot of this new environment and session stuff. I'm still,
Cool.
yeah, I'm still hopping around and running tests and things like that on some other projects just to make sure I haven't overlooked anything. But I think it might be something where I merge it to master and then tag it as a beta release and get it on a project or two, and then say, okay, this is 1.4 or 1.6, whatever it might end up
Nice.
being at that point. But yeah, it didn't require breaking compatibility as far as I can tell, and it should be pretty much a drop-in for any of the admin shells that we use. So the TRC thing, or IRE or Cebu, or the FestMaker and Agent's Title version of the admin shell, it should pretty much just integrate with any of those without additional work. So I didn't do, you know, like a component class in this where you would call set title, because for ours in Framework 1 stuff, we did the navigation with these little static things here. So you just say methods and group or whatever. And it just will automatically use that same thing, because all you're doing is extending a controller, and you can still put those properties on there. So yeah, it should drop in for any of ours in Framework stuff, no matter how old or new it might be. Well, cool. Yeah, if there's no other questions, I think that's all I have for today. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Brad.